offshore wind projects could generate 6,100 jobs. To get the offshore wind energy industry started in Victoria, we've already provided $38 million to progress 3 offshore wind projects: the Star of the South offshore wind project, Flotation Energy's Sea Dragon offshore wind farm, and Macquarie Group's Great Southern offshore wind farm. These projects have the potential to provide more than 40% of Victoria's electricity generation and deliver more than 5,500 jobs. We have also seen a number of other exciting proposals come forward, showing how attractive Victoria is for offshore wind. But building an offshore wind energy industry is about more than just megawatts. We see the capacity to create new industries, develop new supply chains, and be the leader for our region and establish strong community support. Over the past few months, we've engaged in wide-ranging consultation. This has helped us understand what's needed to build a long-term, robust industry. We've consulted with communities, workers, businesses, the energy industry, and port operators to help inform our approach. We are also working with traditional owners to develop a new model of engagement with renewable energy projects based on the principles that align with traditional owner aspirations for self-determination and economic independence. And we are giving priority to engaging local communities and landowners to minimise the impact of development and fairly share the benefits with them. We're also working closely with the Commonwealth Government to ensure that regulatory regimes can support the first offshore wind projects to be delivered in time to meet our targets. I look forward to continuing those conversations with industry to build the strongest offshore wind sector possible and drive billions of dollars of investment into Victoria. Victoria is perfectly positioned to lead the nation in establishing a thriving new offshore wind industry that will create lasting benefits for all Victorians over the coming decades. Our ambitious vision will only be realised through meaningful engagement, so we encourage and welcome your participation. We look forward to continuing to work closely with the Global Wind Energy Council and its members during this exciting and unprecedented opportunity for offshore wind and clean energy more broadly.
So that sets the scene from what's happening in the state of Victoria. The Global Wind Energy Council has been working with regulators and government ministries for some time now in the Australian market. And I'm honoured to actually have a representative from the offshore infrastructure regulator, Mr. Owen Wilson, who's come all the way to Perth to be here today to give us a little bit of perspective about what's happening from the offshore regulator's perspective. Could you please make Owen Wilson ready to welcome to the stand, please?
Thank you, Stuart, for the introduction, and thank you to GWEC and the team for the opportunity to present today. To continue on the theme, I think, that was set by Nick of the cinematic theme today, I think what we'll choose is the Baz Luhrmann epic Australia, because that's what this session is all about, and that's what we hope the wind industry is going to be for us in Australia, particularly offshore wind. So the focus of my presentation today is going to look at the Australian market, and to set some context for the panel session to follow, we'll have a look at where we are now, we'll have a look at Australia's aspirations and where we want to go. But first, just a little bit about the authority itself. So we're a new regulatory authority, and we've just been established under a piece of legislation that came into force as of June 2022. Our major focus is on day-to-day operational regulation and on safety and environmental management, but we have been working very closely with other federal government agencies in Australia to set up a licensing and regulatory framework which will enable offshore renewables projects to be progressed in Australian Commonwealth waters. So that's from 3 to 200 nautical miles offshore in Australia. And it's worth noting there that we do work closely, as the Minister mentioned, with our state and territory counterparts. They're responsible for the first 3 nautical miles and for regulating onshore, including grid connection aspects. So if we have a look at Australia's renewable energy journey, if we look at where we've been, back in 2010, almost 90% of our energy supply was generated from abundant fossil fuel resources, and that's predominantly coal. We travel forward 10 years to 2021, And we see that renewables are starting to play a strong and increasingly important role in the Australian energy mix, with now 30% penetration of renewables into the Australian market. But while renewable energy sources have progressively displaced coal generation over that time, there is still a long way to go to achieve our objectives in the renewable energy space. So if we have a quick look at what's in the mix, oh sorry, that didn't change. Let's try that again, there we go. And we break down renewables energy generation further, we can see that wind and solar have been the technologies that have been really driving the step change in Australia. Australia has the highest per capita penetration of rooftop solar in the world, with about 17 gigawatts of installed capacity across the country, supporting Australian households and businesses. To date, Australia's wind has solely been onshore, and we've got about 9 gigawatts of installed capacity in wind at the moment in Australia. But we need to build on that in order to achieve our objectives, which are on the next slide. So what is the objective? With a recent change of government in Australia, it's heightened interest in emissions reduction and also in the deployment of renewable energy technologies at scale. We now have a legislated target in Australia of 43% emissions reduction by 2030 and a net zero target of 2050. So how do we progress from the current 30% renewables to drive that emissions reduction and to achieve our targets with respect to climate change? This slide focuses on Australia's largest electricity market, which is on the eastern seaboard and feeds into major cities such as Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne, our largest electricity market. The key highlights here are the forecast increase in demand from the grid out to 2050, with an expectation that that will double over that period of time. And that to meet that demand, we're going to need to deploy 9 times our current installed capacity of grid-scale wind and solar. So that's a total of 125 gigawatts of additional capacity that's going to be required in the Australian grid by 2050. Significantly, coal generation, which has consistently been our leading source of generation, is proposed to be completely retired by 2043 under this scenario. And as these assets retire, large amounts of capacity will become available in the Australian grid, and that presents an opportunity for the offshore wind industry to harness. It's important to note also that these numbers don't include the western half of the continent, and they also don't include the energy that's going to be required for behind-the-meter applications such as green hydrogen generation and providing industrial processes with clean energy. So you can expect that these numbers will only increase by 15 to 30%. So if we have a look at the role of wind, again, this information only relates to our largest electricity market on the East Coast, but you can see that on the basis of this scenario and these projections, deployed wind capacity needs to significantly scale up from the current 9 gigawatts to projected 70 gigawatts. Offshore wind can play a leading role in achieving this objective, with the ability to deploy at scale and in locations that are proximate to our large population centres and to establish grid infrastructure. Offshore wind, we know that if it's sited well, can also offer complementary generation profiles to the high degree of solar penetration that we have in Australia, which can smooth out the generation curve and can complement the high penetration of solar that we do have. So certainly there is a space in the market for offshore wind. So let's have a look at some of the challenges and opportunities, and I don't think any of these are unique to Australia, but we'll put them in an Australian context. We are a geographically large nation, and we have a grid that's built for centralised generation from traditional fossil fuel assets. So significant investment in transmission infrastructure will be required, and this is being supported by policy at both the Commonwealth Government and a state government level, with the Australian federal government having committed $20 billion in their Rewiring the Nation policy to modernising Australia's grid infrastructure. But to build this infrastructure, we'll need a workforce, and we've heard from many of the guests today as well as yesterday that workforce is going to be a challenge across a number of jurisdictions in the APAC region. In Australia, we are fortunate to have a highly skilled workforce already in place, and we've got experience in offshore operations, in particular offshore oil and offshore gas. We also have a skilled workforce working in onshore renewables generation. And so with targeted training and reskilling, this workforce can be pivoted and built on to provide the workforce that the offshore wind industry will need to deploy at scale. The next is competition with traditional onshore renewables generation, and we did hear some commentary about this from the CEO panel yesterday. Offshore wind will need to be competitive with onshore options. However, cost is not the only factor to be taken into account here. If we look at the ability to deploy at scale, high capacity factors, potential for reduced environmental and social impact, the ability to locate projects close to market and close to established grid infrastructure, and as we spoke about before, that complementary generation profile to feed into the grid, then offshore wind has a lot of things batting in its corner. But to deploy at scale with targets, and that comes with a pipeline for the release of areas. And so, as we've seen from Stuart and from the Minister, there has been a release of offshore areas that's been announced at a federal level. It's being supported by publicised targets from Victoria, and we understand the New South Wales government, which is our largest energy market, is also looking at targets in the near future. But industry also plays a significant role here. So with interest in Australia is increasing, developers with experience, with established commercial relationships who can attract the supply chain to Australia will be absolutely essential. And finally, environmental and social factors. Offshore wind is the new industry for Australia, for its marine environment and for its communities. The sector brings some novel impacts and risks that will need to be appropriately understood and mitigated in the context of the receiving environments in which these projects are going to take place. And collaboration between industry, governments and the research community will be essential to identifying research priorities, driving robust science and driving innovation in environmental impact mitigation and management. Meaningful consultation with communities and particular First Nations peoples, as highlighted by Minister D'Ambrosio, will be essential to ensuring that the social licence to construct and operate these projects is available in Australia. So let's have a look at the pipeline of areas that have been announced all across the southern part of Australia where we have world-class wind resources. So the Federal Minister announced these 6 areas which will be investigated for licensing over the coming few years. The first area, offshore Gippsland in Victoria, has already attracted significant interest from domestic and international developers, some of whom are with us today and who will be speaking on the panel after this session. The current consultation for Gippsland closes on the 7th of October 2022, and we anticipate that first licences in that region will be granted in 2023. And so this graphic just presents the publicly announced interest in Australian offshore wind and transmission projects that we've already seen. So we've had 32 projects announced in the public domain, and if we add up the generation capacity that those projects are putting forward, that's up to 45 gigawatts of generation capacity. Now, we're aware not all of those projects will get built, but it does give an indication as to the first wave of interest in Australia, and we think that's only going to build. So the numbers are there. Our Minister for Climate Change and Energy attended the Global Clean Energy Action Forum in the US last week to discuss how a clean energy future for Australia can be delivered, including the opportunity that's offered by offshore wind. Australia possesses world-class wind resources, a stable investment climate, a strong energy skills base on which to build. If we combine that with proximity to the Asian market, well-established energy trading partnerships, then we can see that Australia is pretty well positioned to become a regional energy powerhouse. To successfully develop an Australian offshore wind sector, the industry and governments at both the state and federal level will need to work together to address barriers and harness the opportunity before us. And something that's a key step in that journey is for the offshore wind sector to have a strong and united voice in Australia so that they can work directly with governments on harnessing this opportunity. So we welcome you all to come down to Australia, and we hope, just like the film, it's going to be epic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Owen. That was fantastic. Great to see you in Europe. Great that you could make the journey. Thank you very much for coming. Now we get into the panel part of today's session, and we have 3 panellists here in person and 1 joining us online. But I would like to introduce the in-person panellists first. So I'll start off with Michael Hannibal, the partner at CIP. Welcome, Michael. Then I would like to introduce Mr. Carlos Martin, the CEO of Blue Float Energy. Welcome, Carlos. And our final in-person, Florian Ladage, the Senior Business Development Manager at Skyborn Renewables. Thank you. And I believe we have Mr. Yi-Hua Liu from the head of APAC Choreo Generation online. Yi-Hua, can you hear us?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Perfect. Thank you very much for joining us. So let's start the panel. Oh, first of all, could you please make our panelists feel welcome? How rude of me, how very un-Australian. Thank you. So I thought that I'd start off by asking each of you guys to give a little bit of context about how you see, or how each of your companies see the Australian market. And so, Michael, I know that the Star of the South project that you guys have been speaking about for some time now. Let's start with you to provide some context about Star of the South and how you see the Australian market in general.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. In general, we see it, of course, with a lot of opportunities. As we started in 2017 in Australia, at that time, all the 45 gigawatt numbers, they were basically 0 gigawatt. So I think it's fair to say that we were a true pioneer coming into the market, working with 3 founders of a suggestion. And we have happily taken a good chunk of hard work, both with federal ministers and also on the Victoria area, to shape and do this educational journey for them to basically see that offshore energy could actually be very, very complementary to the existing energy mix. Part of its complementarity is that, for example, around Melbourne, if there's 0 wind on the west part of Melbourne, then you actually do have wind on the east side. So the complementarity between onshore renewables, solar, wind, and the offshore sector in Gippsland have proven to be there. So it has been a good journey, a long journey, educational journey for many, but also with a view to a market that we need to unlock, because there are so many good reasons for unlocking it and getting offshore wind into the energy mix in Australia.
Thanks for that, Michael. So I'll turn to you now from Corio Generation. How do you guys see the potential? How does Corio shaping up in Australia?
Thanks, Stuart. Corio sees the Australian offshore wind market very, very positively, and I think it's really come in leaps and bounds since only 12 or 18 months ago. I think if we look at the progress made over the last year, we now have a regulatory framework in place for developers to secure the seabed. We also have the first sort of state-based offshore wind specific targets, as well as a policy framework, and we hope more states join. So I do echo CRP's comment that it's gone from sort of 0 to many gigawatts very quickly. I also think that it's a perfect confluence of factors now that really is making offshore wind a reality. So I think it's broad-based political support in the communities for climate mitigation and for decarbonisation. I think it's very bipartisan support for offshore wind, and also a very permissive regime. And I particularly like the way that the government has gone about it, which is not to try and figure out everything at once. The federal government just figures out or enables private sector to be able to develop the seabed, and then the commercialization and other challenges maybe will be taken on an incremental basis. I quite like that, rather than trying to sort of solve the entire puzzle at once, and it allows, I guess, a gradual process where perhaps the best practices globally can be sort of imported in. So very positive and very hopeful to see this sector grow very quickly in the near future.
Thanks for that. Carlos, we'll turn to you now.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so just as an introduction, Blueford Energy has been working in the Australian market for almost 2 years now with our local partners from Energy State. I must admit that at the beginning, many people were asking us, are you crazy? Why are you going to Australia? Such a vast country with plenty of resources, which is true, but we were very convinced that offshore wind will play a very important role in decarbonizing the economy, because you can produce very significant amount of power close to the load centers. And one of the key challenges in Australia is grid congestion that we can address through producing close to the load centers. So over time, this has proved to be the right strategy. I was in Australia in July, and I was very impressed about by the level of consensus and alignment across all the political spectrum, different administrations, unions, local stakeholders. We had quite a number of town hall meetings in the areas close to our developments there. And I was impressed by the level of support and alignment from many different people. I think I would join my colleagues in praising the good work done by the different governments, which I think, in my opinion, is going to accelerate the deployment of offshore wind. And the challenge we have now, I think, is twofold: is on delivering on these plans quickly. I believe Minister D'Ambrosio was quite cautious in terms of the targets. I think we can build more and faster than what she announced, and we are here to support that. The other important challenge is to develop a local supply chain that can first deliver on that growth, and second, have a local impact in terms of community benefits, in terms of local jobs, industrial development. And we're also very active as a developer in bringing in international companies to the market who are very interested in investing in the supply chain in Australia.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. We'll get into, actually, we'll unpack some of those topics in a little bit more detail in a moment. But Florian, I'd like to turn to you and maybe just even provide a little bit of background about Skyborn. I mean, maybe not everyone in the room has caught up with how Skyborn came to be and what you've been doing in the market.
Sure. Thanks, Stuart, and GWEC for inviting for this session. Very interesting to speak about offshore wind in Australia. Skyborn Renewables was born very new, 10 years ago. So it's the former WPD Offshore team, acquired by GIP, Global Infrastructure Partners, US investment fund. And we are very happy to share this opportunity now to become part of this larger investment fund. And this will definitely foster our development of the company and our project pipe in many countries, and Australia is one of them. Maybe listen to our CEO in the previous session. Achim Berger-Olsen was presenting this, but I think it's a different audience now. So with Skyborn, we have a 30 gigawatt pipeline worldwide with a focus in Europe, in APEC countries, and we will expand this. Several projects going into realization now. And for the Australian market, we stepped in after monitoring it for quite some years and being a bit hesitant, and really we saw the push into renewables and also offshore wind in Australia, starting last year with the offshore bill, and that finally gave the quick decision for market entry. We have a team in Sydney and Melbourne now and working on various projects in the declared zone or announced zones.
Great, thanks for that. Carlos, you mentioned that the Australian government, actually, Owen also spoke about what the Australian government have done, and so we've now got zones in Australia, which is great, and we've now got targets in Victoria, which is great. What other certainties should we be looking for as an industry? What can the Australian government, let's presume the Prime Minister's sitting at home watching this session, wondering what he's going to be doing in Australia. And so what's your advice to him? What are some of the other things that we can tell him what to do in Australia?
So very humbly, I will first again highlight that there's been a lot of good work done so far, but of course this needs to continue. The most important priorities, in my view, having nominated the 6 renewable development zones is very important. We are very happy that our 4 developments fit into these zones. So the selection was done in the right way. I think there's a number of pieces of legislation which needs to be approved following the approval of the offshore wind legislation in the federal parliament. It's very important that we can see the first tenders on these renewable economic areas being called as quickly as possible, because there needs to be momentum ongoing. We're expecting these in the first half of 2023, which I think will be a very good timing to kick the ball rolling and have the first projects being awarded leases for developers like us, having the certainty to invest in site assessment and in consenting these projects. Short-term activity is very important. Long-term visibility is also very important. We have already some targets in Victoria, but I think it's very important that other states also approve similar targets to give certainty for the long term. When we talk to industrials, What they're asking is for a stable and long-term market, and having visibility on that long-term market is very important. A third element, I think, which will be very important is supporting the local industry in making the right investments. Training is very critical. We had a couple of meetings with the unions. They're very keen on involving themselves in getting the right people trained for this new business. So all that requires a certain industrial policy that would be important to put in place. And finally, regional collaboration is very important. I think Australia by itself can be a very big market, but Tasmanian Strait collaboration will be also very, very important. I think we're going to talk about that in a minute. And the whole region, Philippines, Taiwan is a bit farther away, but it's within the area of influence of the East Australian industry, can definitely be part of that regional play, and regional collaboration would be very important.
Thank you for that. Yiwa, what about career generation? What certainty would you guys like to see in the market? Or what other signals would you like to see from government?
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. I think if we just rewind a bit, we have announced 2 projects in the announced Gippsland zone, so Great Eastern, Great Southern, in total more than 4 gigawatts of capacity, and we're obviously looking actively at the other announced potential zones as well. From our perspective, we highly welcome the Victorian government's overall policy framework and offshore wind targets. We're hoping for, or looking forward to more meat on the bone in terms of what they call the implementation strategy. And that document is much more detailed. So it outlines what kind of support will be given, for example, for port upgrades and to support other supporting infrastructure, as well as potentially the revenue model that all of our projects will be bidding into. So as Carlos says, we just look forward to more meat on the bone there. I think to add to what Carlos said, maybe one thing we as Corio would really like to see is a holistic wholesale reform or reconsideration of the grid connection model and regime. It was designed, the Australian system, if you compare and contrast it to the UK system, it's an open access system. It was envisaged originally when renewables or generation comes in an incremental basis. So you add a little bit to the network and you undertake a sort of best or least cost modeling to say, well, where do we build additional publicly funded or shared grid? Where we're at in terms of the energy transition is, I guess, a holistic change or transformational change, where we're trying to decarbonize, as Owen presented, trying to completely take out coal by the 2040s. And so the current way that the grid framework works, it's not the best for developers such as ourselves to spend hundreds of millions of dollars in potentially DevEx to take a project through, because we don't really have certainty until the very end whether we have a grid or not. And also it's sort of missing some potential opportunities where the private sector can sort of collaborate or coordinate with the grid operators to make sure that grid exists. So I think some sort of wholesale reform of the grid is one certainty you'll be looking at. We know that there are various processes already in train, both at a state level and a federal regulator level. So the right conversations are happening. We just want to see them follow through to the end. And then finally, I'd echo sort of Carlos's point as well. We'd love to see other states announce their own sort of views or policy direction offshore wind, and hopefully potentially announce targets and coordinated policy.
Yeah, thanks for that. And every market seems to be, grid challenges seems to dominate every market conversation. So it seems like that's not necessarily unique to Australia, but we'll touch on some of those challenges in a little bit later. But before I move on, Florian, how does Skyborn Renewables see this picture in Australia, and what more certainty would you like to see from government?
Thanks, Stuart. I think with the ambitious targets of the federal and the state targets, it's a pretty good start. How to realize this is next, and key for that is, as Carlos already pointed out, have a quick start now and ensure that there's continuity in project pipeline, and that requires the permitting process to also be very streamlined and in a sequence. So we would appreciate if this is really followed very, very strongly, also with clarity on the rules, how the regulations will be set, and the criteria for potentially competition and the feasibility license process. That's some key aspects that we would like to have clarity in to really get the start going smoothly. There's a lot to learn from other countries. I think it's always nice to have a look and think about the lessons learned in Europe, Germany, and all the older markets.
Yeah, thank you. And Michael, COP's view, I guess you guys were in the market also, like many of you guys have been in the market before. There was even a hint of a target in when they were talking, what I was setting the scene before. What's your ambition for, what would you like to hear coming out of the Australian government?
Yeah, of course I could say some of, or many of the similar things. What I think maybe we should ask, what do we not want to see? And what we do not want to see is that they are blindly copying what have been done in Europe, elsewhere, Asia, US, of bad things. So they shouldn't start up copying too much. They should copy the right things. And then they should simply be so proud, saying that why shouldn't we beat Europe? Why shouldn't we beat US when it comes to timing, when it comes to permitting, when it comes to consenting, when it comes to creating the right environment for industries, for knowledge, for sharing, for developing things, because it can be much easier. And if they simply just start looking at doing what have been done elsewhere, then I'm afraid that they will repeat the bad things also. So of course there's a lot of lessons learned, but they should give it the Australian way and do it smarter and beat the rest with that kind of attitude, because I think we need some new thinking instead of saying, yes, it's a new market, it needs to take 10, 15 years, and then it needs to take another 10 years, and then it needs to, and then it needs to. No, they are great people. They are smart people. They are good, and they have done a lot of good things, so they can do it much smarter. So copy the right thing, and then what we do not want to see is copying all the kind of bureaucracies, all those elements that are slowing things down or making it less transparent. Because I totally agree, predictability, volume, and also a flow of things quite important. But I think it's equally or even more important that we get started and get started with a real project so that supply chain can see it's actually materializing. Because it's basically, if it stays with a lot of talks and plans, then I think it's more vital to get started and then make sure that you do not do something while starting, which is blocking you for doing it in an excellent way going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. We're going to open up the floor to some questions. If anyone has any questions, if you just raise your hand, if there are any questions in the audience. If not, we'll just jump into, or maybe I'll ask the question, ask the panel another question, and you guys can have time to formulate your questions, and so I'll come back to you for questions in a minute. Specifically, we're looking at the Gippsland area as being the first area, and there's an open consultation, as we mentioned earlier, which is primarily looking at the MSP, like maritime spatial planning issues. I guess it's fair to say that's what's dominating that consultation. Are there any uniquely Australian challenges that we're seeing that are unique to Australia that perhaps we haven't seen in other markets? And so, Florian, I'll start with you.
Regarding challenges and maybe barriers in the Australian market, I think it's definitely the distance to other markets and supply chains that is a crucial effect to get started here. We see the APEC market having experience, or Asian market with Taiwan and Korea, Japan now picking this up. Question will be if the supply chain is close enough in that areas that Australia can be seen as a region with these countries as well. That's one point. I think there's also, I think there's greater opportunities than challenges. So I'm pretty optimistic that Australia will overcome that.
Okay, maybe some of the uniquely Australian opportunities then, rather than challenges. Are there anything, I mean, Owen mentioned about the oil and gas workforce that is going to en masse move over to offshore wind. Are there other opportunities in the Australian market?
The Australian market for offshore wind, yeah.
Offshore wind.
It's the size and the scalability at the first place, of course. Yeah. It was really good having a greenfield approach in Australia with such a vast area with good site conditions, water depth and wind speeds, and close to coast sometimes. So I think there's great opportunity. I will also be interested to see how quickly we are moving into floating, and that's maybe a chance and a challenge as both. because we see that the fixed foundation projects might be realized first in the gypsum area and elsewhere, and then floating will come later. But there's a lot of opportunities in Australia, and nonetheless, it's the straightforward approach that the government on federal and state level is doing to really streamline the process.
Thanks. Carlos, what about yourself? Do you see anything that's uniquely Australian in the market that we need to watch out for as a market, as developers?
Yeah, I think, Australian, but I think even site-specific challenges that are important to take into account. Every site is unique wherever you go, and Gippsland, to your original question, has specific challenges that is important to take into account. If you haven't been there, Gippsland is it's coal land. When you travel around, you go to Latrobe Valley, you have these massive open-air coal mines, big coal generation facilities, transmission lines, and so on and so forth. And all that needs to be phased out and replaced with an alternative. And when you meet people with different profiles, everybody is very much aligned in that transition. And they see offshore wind as an opportunity. Now, when you drive around, you also see some signs of opposition to onshore wind farms. So that support is there, but it's an opportunity, and we need to take that opportunity to convince people that it's going to be good for them. So working very closely with local communities is going to be absolutely critical, listening, and the type of things you hear when you're there is we want to make sure that the infrastructure is going to be limited and it's not going to affect our landscape too much. So one initiative we are promoting, for example, is to share the infrastructure to connect to the Latrobe Valley substations. There's basically 10 gigawatts of interconnection between Latrobe Valley and the Melbourne metropolitan area. Out of it is used by coal today, it's going to be phased out, but Latrobe is like 30 kilometers inland from Gippsland. So there needs to be a corridor of interconnection cables reaching that. We can all work separately and each build our own connection line. It's going to be a mess, and it's going to drive opposition, or we can collaborate and try to build one single infrastructure to connect and minimize the impact. That's just one example. In the same direction, people want to see jobs being created locally. And there's a big question mark about the supply chain. Where do we have the right ports, the right fabrication yards to build foundations to serve those wind farms and so on and so forth? So we are visiting those ports, bringing our experience from other markets to understand where we can attract investments so that local community can benefit from the jobs that will be created. But it's very important to engage with these local communities because their support is going to be absolutely critical. Things like visual impact. We have published a visual simulation of our Greater Gippsland offshore wind project for people to get familiarized with what they're going to see and give us feedback about to which extent this is something acceptable. Meeting with environment conservation entities who are sharing their concerns, impact on mammals, and many things. So I think it's very specific site-specific challenges that we face, talking about specific about Gippsland, that need a local approach. And in that sense, when we're talking about regulation, in our view, it's very important that when the government sets rules for tenders, takes these type of issues into account. It's so easy to try to come from lessons learned from other markets and teach people how to do things when the local approach and understanding, listening the local stakeholders is, in our opinion, even more important than bringing expertise from other markets.
Okay, thanks for that. Mikkel, what about yourself? What have you guys seen that's uniquely Australian in either challenges or opportunities?
There's definitely a lot of opportunities, and now we have been in you can say around our sites for several years and have basically completed all the studies for the environmentals and have all the data. So you can say that there are certain things that we need to design and work around, but it's definitely achievable. And then it's already mentioned with you can say harbors where you need to have load out harbors, but that's for me kind of a little bit of a mechanical thing. Then we know how we basically can interact in the local area because we are there and have been there for several years and know how we can generate the service setup also. So more opportunities, but of course there are things that we need to work around and do the right way, making sure we do it with full integration for biodiversity and take all, you can say, stakeholders into account when we do it and when do it right. But we do have the experience for doing so there I'm pretty comfortable.
Great, thanks. This session's kind of got a little bit away from us in time. I'll just see if there are any questions from the audience. If not, then I will then wrap up the panel. Are there any questions? No, so we assume that this has been all perfectly understood. I'm a bit surprised that we've had a session on Australia and no one's mentioned sport yet, but we can get back to that at another day. I'll hand over to you to your final remarks to the audience.
Well, thanks. Maybe I can borrow a line from Ol and say, I really do hope that the industry will be epic. I think there is a unique confluence of factors now and a lot of public support and interest. So my message is, please continue to give us your support and also give us your engagement with this burgeoning industry. I think the more vocal you are, this is for Australians watching at home, the more vocal you are in terms of to your local MPs, etc., I think the better chances that we'll have continued political support and the coordinated policies to enable the success of this industry. And if you are part of the industry, please reach out and contact us, all of us on the panel, because I do believe there's a unique opportunity where, adjacent supply chain can pivot towards offshore wind. So we'd love to talk to you.
Perfect, thank you very much. Florian, what about yourself?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think we are very much looking forward to work together with the federal and state government to realize at least some of our projects in the portfolio. And I think with the 3 projects that we have acquired from Australia's Energy and 6 projects in the announced areas that will be pushed even further forward now, I think we are very excited to see this market moving and hope for very good cooperation and that you don't do the same mistakes that we did in Europe in some countries.
Let's hope so. Carlos, yourself?
Several messages for the authorities. Keep it up and keep moving fast. The opportunity is very exciting, and I think the country is definitely going in the right direction. For all the developers who are not yet in Australia but planning to go there, walk the talk, go local, listen, engage with local stakeholders, have an impact, a positive impact. It's very important. Don't wait for the tender to come and place a bid and that's it. It's very important to engage locally. And for the broader industry, look at Australia. It's plenty of opportunities, and let's work together, developers and industrials, to make sure we develop a local supply chain that enables the execution of these projects, and at the same time that secures a positive impact for the local communities.
Thank you. And then Michael, for the final word.
Yeah, I actually think that there's a lot of developers and also in the panel of really a lot of knowledge harvested globally who are basically ready to come and share that knowledge, enabling that offshore wind can be implemented in the energy mix in a really good way. And I think even GWEC are now focused and have made a working group focusing on to condense those messages. So I think there's a fantastic opportunity. And for the short term, we have a spearhead project which could be an enabler for basically paving the way and building the confidence and also generate really early power compared to the wish list from Victoria.
Yes, thank you very much. So that concludes our session today. I'd like to thank those watching online, particularly Prime Minister Albanese and Minister Chris Bowen, who I know are avid watchers of any sessions on Australian offshore wind. But please thank all of our panelists here today, and that concludes our session.